ברוכים הבאים. התלבטנו מאוד באיזו שפה לקיים את הערב הזה. חשבנו על לפחות 5 אפשרויות. לקיים את הערב בעברית, באנגלית, בצרפתית, בפולנית או ברוסית. כיוון שחתן הערב בקיא בכל אחת מהשפות האלה, ואולי יותר מזה. אבל בסוף, שכחתי יידיש, נכון. בסוף החלטנו, כיוון שיש בקרבנו שגריר רומניה, להקל עליו, למרות שהרומנית שלו מצוינת. וגם העברית אולי, אבל לא הייתי בטוח. אז הלכנו על בטוח, על הלינגואה פרנקה של ימינו, ומכאן ואילך אני אדבר באנגלית. It's difficult to change. Yeah. The subject of this evening, as you know, is the fall of communism and the Jewish question 1989 to 2009. In other words, a perspective of 20 years. And this subject was selected for a number of different reasons. First of all, it's a subject which, for various reasons, has more recently been somewhat overshadowed, and I think wrongly, because the year 1989 was certainly what we say in Hebrew, Shana Mechonenet, and a turning point, a major turning point in world history, and had major implications for the Jewish people. But more importantly, because this evening we are here to honor our colleague, our comrade, our friend, and our fellow worker, Leon Volovici, who, as all of you know, is an expert, among other things, in this very field. So I thought it was appropriate to mark, formally speaking, Leon's retirement from our center, of which he's been a pillar of the last 15 years, by devoting this topic and this erev, this evening, to his work. We had a more intimate meeting among members of our center in which various people said things which we're not going to repeat this evening, because this evening is a more scholarly affair. But I think it is important to stress, and later I will say a few things in more detail when Leon replies at the end of this evening. But it's important to underline that he has been at the Vidal Sassoon International Center for the Research of Anti-Semitism since almost 20 years, and the head of research, and is a major scholar in his own right. We will proceed this evening, first of all, with Professor Yehuda Bauer, and after that will be Raphael Vago from Tel Aviv University, then His Excellency the Ambassador. I will add a number of things before handing over to Leon. First, I have the pleasure to introduce the man who actually founded this center, Professor Yehuda Bauer. We received an email, which I hope you don't mind if I refer to very briefly, from Yehuda, about how he should be introduced, which I think has its own inimitable humor. He writes here, Ani Yoetz Akademi Shel Yad Vashem, אין כל ספק שנולדתי. There's no doubt that I was born, and that אני עדיין חי. Well, we can all see the proof, the living proof of that, and שאני ער, or יאיר. And, of course, I still will say a few things, even though Yehuda probably thinks that that's enough. But I don't think it's quite enough. First thing that we should remember, for those of us who don't know, is that Yehuda was born in Prague. And given the nature of the topic today, and a few other things, I think being born in Prague, now the Czech Republic, is a not insignificant fact. You all know that he has been a major figure, a towering figure in the field of Holocaust studies. He will also add something tonight to his ongoing work in this field. And in 1998, he received the Israel Prize for his research. He's had many, many other distinctions, and acts as the academic advisor of Yad Vashem. I just want to mention briefly the last three books of his, which all may have some bearing one way or the other on tonight's discussion. Jews for Sale in 1995, Rethinking the Holocaust 2001, and I see that this is in print. That means it's come out. Not yet? Or it's in the process? In the process, The Death of the Shtetl. The Death of the Shtetl. So that's something, I can't say that's something to look forward to in terms of the tochen, but I certainly can say it's something to look forward to in terms of the scholarship. So Yehuda will speak. Each one of the speakers will speak between 20-25 minutes, because we have a lot of things to get through and discuss tonight. So Yehuda, do you want to come up here? Yeah.
Thank you, Robert. It's a pleasure to be here in honor of Leon Volovici, especially these days, rather than discussing the various BBCP, Ehud, Ketzele, etc., to concentrate on more serious issues. I am supposed to be talking about period of 1989 and so on, but I won't. I'll deal with something that I think leads up to it. And that is indeed the subject of the research that I hope will be out in book form towards the end of this year. The eastern part of Poland, the Kresy, the area that is now western Belarus and western Ukraine, without the area of Bialystok and Vilna, all of which were annexed by the Soviet Union in September 1939, contained 1.2 million Jews in 1939. In addition, when the war broke out, at least 300,000, but probably more, Jews fled from central and western Poland to the Soviet areas. Of these, most of these refugees were deported by the Soviets to Siberia, which on the one hand, for most of them, by no means all of them, meant that they could save their lives, which they didn't realize, of course, at the time that they were deported in the most horrible way. And secondly, that was a group of people that then, those that remained alive, moved back into Poland and the West and contributed very substantially to the establishment of the State of Israel. Now, in the Kresy themselves, very few people were deported. by the Soviets. And very relatively few managed to flee before the Germans occupied the area. So that only about 2.5% of these people survived in the area, in the Kresy area. Nevertheless, that means that approximately 25,000 people managed to survive, so we've got a very large number of testimonies, where the Soviet period is sort of covered up, naturally, by what followed. Nevertheless, we do have a lot of information about the Soviet period. So we can judge Soviet policies from the people who were its victims. And that is a tremendous advantage, of course. Now, what happened when the Soviets occupied the area was that the Sovietization proceeded very quickly. The reason being that the Soviets were afraid of the Germans, and they wanted to adapt the social structure of the newly occupied area to the Soviet area as quickly as possible to present a kind of a defense, a social defense, along with a military defense, which they tried to organize very unsuccessfully. Now, what happened to the Jews happened in a way to others too. The Jews formed 10% of the population of the area. About 30% were Poles, and 60% were Ukrainians and Belarusians. So the Sovietization of the Ukrainian and Belarusian and Polish population took place in the same way that it had taken place in the Soviet Union itself. Soviets were founded, and people that the Soviets thought they could rely on were nominated different positions. The communities were not destroyed as such. The people who were in charge of them changed, but not the communities as such. With the Jews it was completely different. The communities were destroyed. There was nothing left. There were no communities anymore. The social structure, the social organizations, the educational organizations, the religious organizations, all that was annihilated, was destroyed. The problem, however, is that it wasn't so much the Soviets who destroyed it by action. It was the Jews who gave it up without very often the Soviets even issuing any orders. The social organizations, the political parties, everything collapsed before the Soviets even had time to issue their orders. A whole civilization that had existed for hundreds of years, if not more, collapsed within weeks. Now, why? Well, there was not only terror that was sure to come, and people knew that, of course. There was also the carrot, not only the stick. For the first time in an area that had been controlled by Polish anti-Semites, basically, the Jews had now equal non-rights, because nobody had rights in the Soviet Union. But they were equal. They could occupy positions. They could study at schools and universities. There were cultural events and all that sort of thing, which were very much appreciated, especially by the young people. The Zionist movements, contrary to all kinds of legends that I was part of that, we spread, collapsed. In many places, in most places, after a short period, after a few months, young Zionist enthusiasts became young Komsomol enthusiasts. Komsomol enthusiasts. We have detailed accounts, for instance, in East Galicia, for instance, in certain areas of Volhynia, less so in the Belarusian area. The underground Zionist movements, Hashomer HaTzair and Dror and Noir Zioni and Gordonia, they tried to organize some kind of an underground. It was very heroic, very heroic. It was also very pathetic. It was also completely useless. The people were arrested. It collapsed within a few months. There was nothing left. The religious life, young people left. Elderly people managed to maintain minyanim here and there. There was no official order to close synagogues. Officially, you could maintain synagogue life, provided you paid taxes that were impossible to pay because they were so high that it was out of the question. But religious life collapsed as well. So, this is deeply troubling, deeply troubling. A totalitarian dictatorship can, in this case, destroy an ancient culture within weeks. Did it really destroy it, though? Because when the Germans afterwards came, it sort of sprang up again. The communities under completely different conditions, of course, reorganized. The people who had been leaders before, if they were not deported, came back and occupied positions under the new terrorist regime of the Nazis. And so there's a question that I can't answer. I don't have the answers. We have to do some research, a lot of research, in order to try to find proper answers. Hypotheses, I can give you hypotheses from here till tomorrow morning. But nothing that can be proved, nothing concrete. Now, the Soviet regime that came in was, of course, as you all know, ridden with corruption, ridden with inefficiency, ridden with a attitude that can only be described as a regime of terror, which found a lot of supporters, not only amongst Jews who welcomed the Soviets because the alternative was the Germans, but also amongst Poles, who were the first and main victims of the Sovietization of that area. The Poles had been the rulers, so obviously the Soviets turned against them. Proportionately, more Jews were exiled to Siberia than Poles. Out of the 800,000 people approximately who were exiled by the Soviets from those areas into Siberia, 50% were Poles. But the Poles were 30% of the population. But 30% were Jews, and the Jews were only 10% of the population. So 300%, relatively speaking, more Jews were deported. And yet the brutality of the deportation hit the Poles, not the Jews. The Jews were deported. It was not nice. It was terrible. But the Poles were beaten and killed and tortured before they were deported in prisons. And one of the major sources for that period, Jan Thomas Gross's book, Revolution from Abroad, deals mainly with Poles. And so so it's quite true that the main victims were the Poles, not the Jews. There was no no official anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism was popular anti-Semitism of the people who came in, Russians, Ukrainians sometimes, and of course of the local population. But the government was not anti-Semitic. And there you see a development that this changes afterwards. Anti-Semitism after that, as we all know, becomes official. Anti-Semitism after that becomes a mainstay in Soviet propaganda, internal and external propaganda. Not at that time. In fact, when you examine what happened after the German occupation, namely that small minority of Jews that went into the forest to fight as partisans. You see the attitude of the Soviet partisans. I can tell you, thousands of Jews were killed by Soviet partisans. But that came from the bottom. That came from the ordinary Soviet partisan who was anti-Semitic. He had been a soldier in the Soviet army. He was a Russian. He was a Ukrainian. He was whatever. The commanders were not anti-Semitic. Brinsky and Chernishev and Suvorov and Kopchak and all the others were not anti-Semitic. In fact, they defended the Jews against anti-Semitism. It's a very complicated situation. And there is, in my view, a difference between the Soviet regime and the Nazi regime in these things, not only in terms of anti-Semitism. National Socialism was built on an opposition to the legacy of the French Revolution. It wanted to rebel against it. It rebelled against the whole development of European traditions. Soviet communism was based on an ideology, Marxism, which saw the bourgeois revolution, the French Revolution, as a positive thing. It wanted to continue it, changing the ruling class from the bourgeoisie to the proletariat. But ideally, it presented humanistic ideas, which was then completely distorted in the Soviet regime. But the Soviet regime was based on this ideology. It could not deny, because otherwise it would have denied itself. Where can you see this? You can see this very clearly in the great Stalinist Constitution of 1936. Right? Read that Constitution. You'll have a good laugh. It's the most liberal constitution you could possibly imagine. Individual rights and free elections, not multi-party, but free elections, and freedom of press and freedom of conscience, and equality of opportunity, and free education to all. And the kids in the Kressi, Jewish kids in the Kressi, had to learn this stuff by heart. And they learned it by heart. Now, when they went out of school, the reality outside of school was exactly the opposite of what the Constitution had promised. This contradiction, however, was real, because there were Soviet idealists who really tried to build up things. And there were successful experiments of that kind in the Kressi, as they were elsewhere. And there was Soviet Bolshevik idealism there, and it was, in essence, in its historical roots, humanistic, contrary to the Soviet regime as such. Let me give you a story. Those of you who know me know that there's never a lecture by me that is not there's not a story. There has to be a story. There is, he's still around, a former member of the staff of the Hebrew University. Many of you know him, Zev Katz. Now, Zev Katz comes from Poland, of course, Yaroslav. And his father was a small manufacturer, had a little sort of shop. When the Germans came, they fled, all 6 of them, to the east, to the Kressi. So there was Papa Katz and Mama Katz and 4 little Katzes. And Zev Katz was 14 years old. Now, what would they do? A not very healthy ex-manufacturer was a capitalist, right? Very difficult. So the older brother, 17 years old, went to work, of course, and the father, whatever he could do, but they couldn't exist like that, so they engaged in trade, which, of course, was illicit, forbidden. little Zeev went to school, Russian school, because if we are already in Russia, in the Soviet Union, we better go to a Russian school, not to a Yiddish school. From the Russian school, you might have chances in the future. Okay. And in the Russian school, he learned the Constitution by heart. And then, of course, they were caught. They were put on a train, and they ended up in a gulag in Kazakhstan. The book by Zeev Katz was published by Cass in London 4 years ago, and it's called From Gestapo to Gulag, One Jewish Life. You can check what I'm telling you. Now, they are in some place, horrible place. They have to fell trees, otherwise they won't eat. Now, the father is not very strong. There's the 17-year-old boy, there's the 16-year-old boy, and the third in line is little Zeev, who is now 15 years old. And he remembers, in the gulag, the Constitution. So he gets a piece of paper, very difficult in a gulag to get a piece of paper, and a pencil. And he writes a letter to Comrade Yosef Vissarionovich Stalin, General Secretary of the Communist Party, in brackets B, Bolsheviks, in Moscow. I am Zeev Katz, my age is 15, I'm entitled by the Constitution to education, I can't get it here, do something about it. He sent it twice, with 2 drivers, he bribed them. And apparently it arrived in Moscow. Now, Comrade Stalin had more important things to do at the moment. This is now the spring of 1941. He was just misdirecting the war against the Germans. So this was sent to some fourth secretary, you know, somebody like that, in the Central Committee of the party. And indeed, there was an answer. And the answer said, young Comrade Zeev Katz is absolutely right. He has the right, and something should be done about it. So the regional Soviet in Kazakhstan, in that area, should do something about it. The regional Soviet met and decided they can't do anything about it. But this is now August 1941. There's the agreement between the Polish government in exile in the Soviet Union, and Polish citizens are now released from gulags. But not in that gulag, because it's so far away from anywhere. So little Zeev Katz, together with some others, organizes a strike. Just imagine the Soviet Union in the gulag, a strike. They don't go out to fell trees anymore, because they know that there was an agreement, etc., etc. And believe it or not, nothing happens to them, because there was that letter, you know. Somebody might ask questions. So they are sent to the nearest railway station, which is very long way away, and they are brought to Semipalatinsk, where young Zeev Katz is entitled to go to school. Apart from dealing in black market with medicines that come in and so on, that they sell the medicines, they get food instead of it, etc., etc. But they manage to survive. Now, you see, that could not have happened in Nazi Germany. No, not because it's a Jew here, and out of the question. The idea of rights of a citizen in a no-rights state. Both states there were no rights. But there were positive no rights in the Soviet Union, whereas there were negative no rights in the Nazi Empire. There is a difference. And the difference then expresses itself in the way things develop. The Nazi Germany could not have collapsed by itself. No way. But a corruption-ridden, totally contradictory social scheme in the Soviet Union collapsed of itself. Well, there were people who helped. But it wasn't, it didn't fall as a result of a war. It fell as a result of its inner contradictions. The Soviet regime was different. It was totalitarian. It was a different totalitarian state from the Nazis. And so as I rush through all this at breakneck speed, I have a few minutes left. And so, because, as I told Robert before we came in here, one of the sins of my youth, as I told somebody else when I was young and beautiful, and now I'm only beautiful. I studied military history, amongst other things. And there you see a major issue with the Soviet regime, because ideologically speaking, the quarrel between Stalin and Trotsky, quite apart from power issues and personal issues, was a real one. Trotsky wanted a continuation of the revolution, like other chiastic movements, like other utopian movements, like Christianity, like Orthodox Judaism, like others. The Geulah, the redemption will come now. In Christianity, we all know the New Testament was written in the expectation of the second coming of Jesus. There would be the end of the world, and Jesus would judge over the world. Shabtai Tzvi, the same thing, etc., etc., etc. In the case of the Soviets, it was a revolution now. The time was ripe. Capitalism was collapsing. And Trotsky was absolutely convinced, if we export the revolution abroad, we will have a tremendous success. The development of Soviet policy understanding was the exact opposite. Socialism in one country. So you had a defense system, political defense system. The Soviet Union was a place which had to protect itself defensively against the outside capitalist threat, and only after that was there a possibility of exporting the revolution. Not that Stalin ever gave up the idea of the export of the revolution. World revolution was definitely in the cards, but not now, a bit later. Militarily, they followed the opposite line. Militarily, they followed a line that had been developed in the 1920s under Tukhachevsky, where the answer, world revolution. So if we are attacked, we will bring the war to the territory of the enemy. There will be no war on Soviet territory. It'll be on the territory of the attacking capitalist countries. But then, especially during and after the purges, when the Soviet army was totally destroyed in terms of its command structure, they began following the same policy. Instead of defending themselves, they tried to convince themselves that if we are attacked, and hopefully we will not, we will bring the war to the enemy's territory. And so they concentrated the mass of their army and their air force in the areas close to the border, which meant that within the first 3 or 4 days of the war, the Germans destroyed 2,500 Soviet aircraft, which meant that they cut through the defense line of the Soviet army. The Soviets were fighting. They were not yielding. They were fighting, but they were defeated. The success of the Soviet army later on was to revert to the defensive position, to build deeply structured defense lines, which they had actually begun preparing before the war. But Stalin dismissed that. The Stalin line along the border between old Poland and the Soviet Union, to remove the airfield, to remove the aircraft hundreds of miles away so that a sudden attack could not reach them, and then be able to respond in terms of an counter-air attack. The balling together, which was there were people who actually supported this, Shaposhnikov, Vozdesensky, and others, to concentrate the tank armies in back, so that when the Germans went and extended their lines of communication, the Soviets would be able to respond. That was the obvious thing. That is what Zhukov did. when the Germans reached the outskirts of Moscow in November 1941. That's exactly what he did. He did it again in the defense of Stalingrad, preparing an attack at the back while holding out and defending Stalingrad under General Chuikov until he was ready to attack. He did it again in the Battle of Kursk. So you see, I have to stop. But there is this development. There is the strength of the Soviet regime and the internal worm that eats it. And it's the worm in the end that destroys it from within. Thank you.
Thank you, Yehuda. I'd just like to, if I may, just reinforce something you said from my own personal family history, because quite a lot of what you said at the beginning was placing into context things which my own parents and grandparents lived through exactly at that time in the eastern part of Poland, when they were in fact deported to the east, to Lvov, and later from Lvov to the interior of the Soviet Union. That was before I was born, but it's become a part of my own history. And there are two little anecdotes which really underline what you said. First of all, what happened to my mother, who was about 30 years old at the time in Lvov in 1940-41, and had a degree from the Jagiellonian University of Krakow, but could never have employment in Poland in the interwar period. And as soon as the Soviets came into control of the city, within a very short time, she was appointed the head manager over a group of Ukrainians and Poles, because they felt, given her history, that they could rely on her precisely because she was of a Jewish ethnic background. So, of course, she was very pleased at that. My father had a less agreeable fate because he made the mistake at a kind of trade union meeting of doctors to actually tell the truth about his class background. And as soon as he was branded, so to speak, as the son of a landowner, because my grandfather owned a sawmill not far from Krakow, he was, of course, very summarily dealt with. The second thing is that much later, 1945 in Kazakhstan, when my father was imprisoned by the NKVD, and he was very fortunate to survive that experience, a key turning point, he always told me in his interrogations that seemed endless, was when they accused him of having said to a nurse in a hospital, the local hospital, that after the war, the Western democracies would make sure that Poland would never turn Soviet. He was accused of that, and that could have been 10 years in the Gulag. And he had an inspiration which I think saved his life, because he then thought for a moment, and then he said, I don't understand. Surely Comrade Stalin said that after the end of the war, Poland would be free and democratic. And that's all that I was saying. And his interrogators were totally nonplussed, and one of them, by the way, was Jewish, a Jewish NKVD officer. And I think that's probably a reason why he survived. Our next speaker is Dr. Raphael Vago, who's a senior lecturer and senior research fellow in the Department of History at Tel Aviv University and at the Stephen Roth Institute, the rival place. I won't go on.
I'm always here when you invite me.
You know, but we're objective, as you can see. And Raphael I've known for many years as a leading expert in the field of East European and East European Jewish history, also Holocaust studies, anti-Semitism, nationalism, minorities, all the things that go together with any serious scholar of Eastern Europe. And, of course, post-communist Eastern Europe as well. I should also mention that he has been teaching in recent years regularly courses to Romanian educators, and also at the University of Cluj, which I had the good fortune to visit for the first time with Leon, and which is a very remarkable place in many ways. He is the editor of a 4-volume history of the Jews in Romania, of which 2 volumes have already been published, and which also contains a study by Leon. And we're very pleased that he's agreed to come here and to give us the fruits of his long study of this region.
Thank you very much. The language problem that you mentioned at the beginning, what language we should speak, is also have a large influence upon me, because it seems to me unnatural that I, born in Cluj, Kolozsvár, Romania, my language of communication with my old friend Leon, born in Iași, is English, of course. And that's the problem of globalization. As you know, Leon, there are 2 types of faraway parties like ours. The first type is when everybody's happy and smiling, but they say, why the hell the guy didn't go away retiring 10 years ago? The second type is our type, when people are still smiling and happy, but they are sad that you are leaving. And I'm sure that you will not leave really, but this is just an occasion to honor you and, of course, the topics that you have been working on 20 years. I always feel bad when I'm in a panel with Yehuda, because I feel very bad that someone had to stop Yehuda with all his wonderful stories, because someone has to go on talking at this panel. And I wish I could have heard you more. Since 1989, we speak very much about a revival of Jewish life in the post-communist countries in Eastern Europe. Very briefly, I would like to present a more kind of theoretical framework, less name-dropping of institutions, organizations, and names of persons, personalities, and to try to provide a short framework for the understanding of the Jewish revival in Eastern Europe and the problems associated with this revival. Since 1989, there have appeared many studies and books about the fate of Jews in Europe, especially in Eastern Europe. In one of the major studies published by Professor Bernhard Wasserstein in his book Vanishing Diaspora about 10 years ago or so, he argued that in the near future there will be few Jews left in Europe, except small pockets of Orthodox communities whose identity is less endangered in the near future. The rest of the Jewish communities will have a vague sense of having Jewish ancestors, but little other significant identification. Jewish existence in Europe, he said, will be a disembodied memory. Another researcher, Charles Hoffman, wrote a very interesting book soon after these European revolutions, Grey Dawn, about the future of Jews in Eastern Europe. And he summed up what is the state of the Jewish communities in the late 80s, early 90s. I quote, Jewish life was eventually reduced under communism in most places to synagogues, soup kitchens, and cemeteries. Jews were allowed to pray as Jews, eat as Jews, and die as Jews. Anything else, particularly Jewish cultural activities that exceeded the narrow bounds of religious life, was forbidden, particularly the study of Hebrew. As you may see from both sources, they're very pessimistic in the early 90s about the possibility of a revival and the future of Jewish life in Eastern Europe. I would like to analyze these 2 opinions without really having a clear judgment what will be the future, but I will try, although being a historian, to say some very brief remarks about the future. The first point I would like to analyze is the pattern of post-communist revival in the Jewish communities. My thesis is that if in 1944-48, the period of the communist takeovers, the communization, the Sovietization, there were almost similar processes in the general framework of society, in communizing the society, vis-à-vis communizing the Jewish communities, my question would be, a methodological question, is the process of decommunization after 89 similar to the patterns that were in 48, 49, when the local societies and the Jewish societies society underwent the same processes of communist takeovers. If you had like in Romania, the Jewish Democratic Committee, you had this type of organizations, frameworks for other nationalities, and so forth. My claim is that we can see quite similar patterns in the decommunization of the Jewish communities after 1989 and the revival of Jewish life, quite similar patterns to those of the society around them, not one-to-one, but in general patterns. More than that, I would say that the general pattern of the revolutions in Eastern Europe, the collapse of the communist regimes, will be reflected on the Jewish level almost in the same type of intensity, passions, and feelings. For example, if the researchers of post-communism define the Hungarian collapse of the regime in Hungary as the most negotiated revolution, similar to the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia, Czech Republic, then Czechoslovakia, and Romania, the most extreme case of the collapse of the regime, of the Ceausescu regime, I would say that the Jewish deconstruction of the communist regime in the Jewish community followed almost the same pattern. For example, already in 1987-88, in Hungary, the first civil society type of Jewish organization called the Cultural Association of Jews in Hungary started to appear in the yet existing communist regime, parallel to the formation of the first civil society groups and dialogues with the regime within Hungarian society. And in between these two extremes, Hungary and Romania, we see the appearance of Jewish organizations parallel to the collapse of the communist regime. My second question is, what forms and shape the decommunization of Jewish community life and organization took? First of all, the general pattern was of a removal of the existing leadership